Hi, everybody. You're very welcome to our webinar. I'm just going to wait a few seconds for everybody to join before we get started. Hi, everybody. You're welcome to our webinar. I'm just waiting a few seconds because people are still trickling in, and then we'll get started. Okay, we're going to get started with today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. So the topic of our panel discussion today is authoritarian regimes and gender-based violence. How right-wing governments use the protective discourse to justify their harms against women and girls. I'm Dr. Shirley Graham. I'm the Director of the Gender Equality Initiative in International Affairs at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Thank you for joining me and my students today for this very important panel discussion where they get to share their research. Each fall, I invite students from my Global Gender Policy graduate course and my Women in Global Politics undergrad course to submit their research to the UN Commission on the Status of Women. So essentially what I do is I give my students an opportunity to speak on these parallel paths. I'm delighted to say that our proposals have always been accepted by the Commission on the Status of Women. And in fact, we have increased the numbers of students speaking each year, and we now have 4 panels of 20 students. So just to talk a little bit more about the Elliott School's Gender Equality Programme, we have 24 courses on gender and international affairs. That's more than any other university in the DMV area. And it's very important in terms of the Elliott School acknowledging the importance of a gender analysis in international affairs if we are to have a holistic understanding of security issues and international affairs more broadly. So like I said, today's event is very much focused on authoritarian regimes and gender-based violence. As we all know, this is the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action. And in fact, we are seeing a resurgence in authoritarian regimes and illiberal democracies who are emboldening each other to push back women's rights and gender equality. So essentially, they're using women's bodies as political tools. This obviously sets back women's rights, and it endangers not only them, but also LGBTQ plus populations. In our panel today, we're going to be discussing El Salvador, which is very much in the news right now. And we're going to be talking about China, Hungary, and Brazil to discuss institutional and state-sponsored violence against women and girls. So who do we have with us today? So we have 5 fabulous students, and yes, I am biased, from my courses. So I'm going to read out a little bit about each of these wonderful students. We have Valentina Paz, who is a dedicated advocate for international human rights and women's empowerment. She is a senior studying international affairs with minors in French and women, gender, and sexuality studies at George Washington University. She is also the president of Zeta Phi Beta Sorority, and she has led award-winning community service and fundraising initiatives at the local, regional, and national level. She plans to become a lawyer focusing on international human rights and has already gained experience as a confidential sexual violence advocate, contributing to criminal defense investigations at Georgetown Law. So you're very welcome, Valentina. We look forward to hearing more from you shortly. We also have joining us Paige Garvin, who is a second-year international affairs student at George Washington University, concentrating in conflict resolution with a minor in journalism and mass communications. She is particularly interested in conflict transformation and international humanitarian law. Paige hopes to expand her knowledge on gender policy and the role of peace building in fostering intersectional frameworks, and she aims to integrate these interests throughout her future career. Next, we have Preeti Kulkarni, who is a second-year international affairs student at George Washington University with a concentration in international development and a minor in international business. She currently interns for the Cato Institute as a Sphere Initiatives intern and is an incoming intern with the Chamber of Commerce. She is particularly interested in democracy and governance, and Preeti hopes to build her interest in mitigating political polarization within democratic institutions and the role of gender policy and development throughout her career. Next, we have Rebecca Kaplan, who is a second-year student at George Washington University studying international affairs with an anticipated double major in biology. Currently, Rebecca is working as a legislative intern at the United States House of Representatives. She aims to deepen her knowledge in national security, focusing on biodefense and science policy as she progresses throughout her undergraduate career. So you're all very welcome, panelists. And now I'd like to introduce Seamus Smith, who is our moderator for today's event and currently taking my Women in Global Politics course. So Seamus is a senior at George Washington University's Elliott School, majoring in international affairs with a concentration in international politics and a minor in public policy. Originally from Natick in Massachusetts, he aspires to work in political campaigns or serve as a foreign service officer, ideally in public diplomacy or political cones. So during the last election cycle, he worked on progressive campaign advertisements, focusing on Montana and specifically on the CI 128 Abortion Constitution Initiative. So thank you for your advocacy and your political work, Seamus. And now I'm going to hand over to you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Gender Equality Initiative International Affairs CSW 69 panel with Preeti Kulkarni, Valentina Paz, Rebecca Kaplan, and Paige Garvin. My name is Seamus Smith. I'm a senior at the Elliott School. I study international affairs and public policy, and today we'll be discussing authoritarian regimes, gender-based violence, and how right-wing governments use the protective discourse to justify their harms against women and girls. It has been 30 years since the adoption of the Beijing Platform for Action, and we're seeing a resurgence in authoritarian regimes. We're emboldening each other to use women's bodies as political tools, setting back progress on women's rights, and endangering them and LGBTQAI+ populations. This panel highlights the cases of El Salvador, China, Hungary, and Brazil to discuss institutional and state-sponsored violence against women. Our panel of 4 dedicated young women have spent countless hours researching this very pressing and unfortunately very timely topic. They attended the 69th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, which was held at the UN headquarters in New York this past week, and we're very fortunate to have them speak here today. As we're going throughout the panel, I'm sure there'll be many questions for our wonderful panelists. If you would like to have your question answered, please post them in the Q&A section below, and we'll answer all questions at the end of the panel. Welcome, and please join me in hearing more about their incredible research over the next 90 minutes. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I can begin. Thank you, Dr. Graham, for the wonderful introduction, and again, for the opportunity to be here today and speak on an issue that's really important to me. My name is Valentina Paz, and today I'll be discussing the critical issue of violence against women in El Salvador, particularly in light of President Bukele's 2022 state of exception/emergency. I'm sure people have been seeing the news recently, but just a few days ago, news broke out that El Salvador has agreed to house almost 300 alleged Venezuelan gang members in its notorious prison. This would be a part of a $6 million deal with the United States. And this agreement, though, in the process of whether or not it's actually going to be passed, and I know certain alleged gang members have already been on their way to El Salvador, this agreement between President Nayib Bukele and the Trump administration is just the latest in a series of tough on crime measures that have garnered Bukele significant praise from many leaders and Salvadorian citizens. But while these actions may seem like progress on the surface, they mask a troubling reality, and that is the human rights violation in El Salvador that are persisting and have been exacerbated under Bukele's administration. I want to note that these issues have begun long before his presidency, but they continue to worsen, particularly affecting women and marginalized communities and showing up through high rates of femicide, gender-based violence, and social economic insecurity. So the three key problems that have been exacerbated by these recent developments that I highlight in my policy brief. The first is the increased military presence. In November of 2019, President Nayib Bukele signed a decree authorizing military involvement in police duties. This means that there have been more police and military officials in what once was gang-controlled neighborhoods. This has resulted in a widespread of human rights violation. Women have reported facing verbal and physical harassment from security forces, and the fear of retaliation prevents reporting. And this situation has clearly created a culture of impunity, leaving women trapped between the gang violence that still does persist and the abuse of power by those that are meant to protect them. Second, women are increasingly facing severe financial burden. We're talking about a society where machismo culture often makes women financially dependent. And the mass incarcerations that are affecting about 1.6% of the population are leaving many women solely responsible for supporting their families. Now they must provide for both household needs and the expenses of their imprisoned partners because the inadequate prison systems in El Salvador fail to provide essential items like hygiene products and uniforms to inmates. And finally, we're seeing an attack on women's rights organization. The government has had a really strong crackdown on civil society organizations that are critical of the administration. This past November, there was a targeting of 7 human rights groups, which included 2 prominent feminist organizations in El Salvador, La Medidas and Pro Vida, which both focus on healthcare and promoting democratic institutions. What's really alarming about this crackdown is that it coincides with the considering of a controversial foreign agents law by the Salvadorian legislator, which would impose severe restrictions on NGOs receiving international funding by requiring them to register as foreign agents and prohibiting them from engaging in what is vaguely defined as political activities. And so these actions are severely undermining the ability of women's rights organizations to advocate for and protect survivors of gender-based violence, leaving many women without crucial support systems and resources in a country that's already grappling with high rates of femicide and domestic abuse. So to address these issues, I proposed 3 policy recommendations. The first would be the implementation of a multi-donor economic support program. And this would provide direct financial assistance to the affected families, prioritizing single mothers. This would offer job training and placement services implemented through local organizations with support from international bodies like the IMF, the IDB, and the World Bank. And by structuring this as a multi-donor initiative, we can ensure that women from all different socioeconomic backgrounds and gender identities, as well as Indigenous women who are typically left out in the country's women, peace, and security agenda, would have access to these tailored approaches. The second proposed solution is increasing funding for women's rights organization. This is where UN Women, for example, could provide crucial financial support to empower the local organizations like Ormusa and Kamkavas that are already doing such amazing work and reaching so many communities. By increasing funding, this could significantly enhance their outreach and the impact of these organizations, because such funding would enable them to examine power structures and illustrate how these dynamics affect women's lives, particularly highlighting the disproportionate impact of militarization of women, for example, which is an issue that's overlooked in the traditional political analyses. And finally, enhancing the role of media. Where economic opportunities are limited and social services lack substance, a critical way to educate women on their rights and resources is through social media campaigns. And this is outlined in the Beijing Platform for Action. We should utilize social media campaigns to educate women on their rights and available resources. These campaigns once again could target the marginalized communities and provide them with information on legal rights and support services. And again, this is where women's rights organizations in El Salvador, she had the ability to partner with international bodies like the UN Women for the Initiative. Because while Bukele's tough stance on crime may seem effective, we cannot overlook the human rights violations that continue to plague El Salvador. Implementing these recommendations is crucial to dismantling systems that perpetuate violence. We must prioritize the voices of Salvadorian women, especially those from marginalized groups and communities. Because without action, we risk continued violence and deepening systemic inequalities that jeopardize the future of an entire generation. So thank you so much again for having me on this panel, and I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you so much, Valentina, and thank you to Dr. Graham for the wonderful introduction. Just to reiterate, my name is Preeti Kulkarni, and I'm a sophomore studying international affairs at the George Washington University with a concentration in international development. I'm an intern with the Cato Institute and an incoming intern with the Chamber of Commerce. However, as a note, all opinions I state on this panel are my own personal views and are not indicative of the views of any organizations I'm affiliated with. In this panel, I chose to focus on the forced sterilization of Uyghur women because of a story. This story is of Zumrat Dawat, a 42-year-old mother and Uyghur woman from Urumqi. Zumrat paid a fine for committing the crime of having 3 children instead of 2. She was quote-unquote offered a free sterilization. However, this offer came with a price. She was threatened with the possibility of detainment if she did not submit to the procedure, so she did. From recent news, I learned that she was detained despite this, but was eventually given asylum in the United States. Zumrat's story is just one of many stories highlighted by Dr. Adrian Zenz in a 2021 report about forced sterilizations in the Xinjiang province. The Uyghur genocide, as we know, is still ongoing, but the United States is still taking pointed action regarding it. This past week, Secretary of State Marco Rubio has called for the imposition of sanctions on Thai government officials for deporting 40-plus Uyghur men held in detention centers for concern of susceptibility to forced labor. Noted by the Wall Street Journal this week, Western companies have also almost entirely pulled out of Xinjiang due to these concerns. However, the one aspect left unnoticed is the forced sterilizations. Forced sterilizations have been used as a tactic of repressive intent across contexts. The last report in the Uyghur context was the aforementioned one by Zenz from 2021. As of July 9th, 2024, this crisis is still ongoing, marking almost 4 years without any updated data on this international crisis. In this report, Dr. Zenz analyzes measures to forcibly suppress birth rates among ethnic Uyghur communities, including the mass application of mandatory birth control and sterilizations with the intent to reduce the Uyghur population in Xinjiang relative to the numbers of ethnic Han Chinese to accelerate Uyghur assimilation. While these sterilizations are rarely ever explicitly mandated, they're, quote, offered, with a near guarantee of internment if not completed. This use of coercion allows for these policies to be hidden tactics of genocide. The problems that these procedures spur are immense. There has been a stark decline in Uyghur natural population growth, falling by almost 84% between 2015 and 2018. In some regions, the birth rate has been near zero, indicating that there has been a mass sterilization effort in the area with no signs of retribution. Forced sterilization has a myriad of impacts on a woman's health and well-being. Often these procedures induce early menopause, which is accompanied by a multitude of side effects like bone loss and increased risk of heart disease, strokes, dementia, and osteoporosis. These tactics used by the Chinese government also directly attack Uyghur language and culture, among other key social markers. Women serve as religious teachers and the arbiters of ritual that they pass down through generations. Uyghur women's sphere of influence is also limited, almost exclusively functioning in the interpersonal and individual spheres of influence through this dissemination of culture to their children. Thus, by inhibiting them from exercising their bodily autonomy and preventing them from creating another generation, The Chinese government stops the spread of culture that would occur through that familial connection. Through these procedures, the collective health of Uyghur women, their bodily autonomy, and their ability to exercise influence within their culture is being taken away from them, violating the women and health principle of the Beijing Platform for Action and having broader societal impacts for the Uyghur people. I've studied this phenomenon in an Indian context as well. A story like Zumrad's sparked my passion and conviction for this topic. I have found that the best ways to generate collective action in opposition to this repressive practice are as follows. Increased media coverage. The human rights violations that the Uyghurs face are seldom mentioned in a majority of coverage regarding China anymore. By bringing forced sterilizations and allowing Uyghur women to vocalize their experiences, it rallies the global community around them. Increased media coverage would pressure China to stop these practices, risking further normative ostracization and allowing for more consistent information about this phenomenon. Improvement in data collection and pointed condemnation from supranational and regional actors are also mechanisms of collective action that I intend to expand upon later. The best way to condemn atrocities alike is to galvanize all sectors of public life under our shared norms. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Graham and Seamus, for those wonderful introductions. And hello to all of those who are taking the time out of your day to join our panel. It's really exciting to be here to speak on these very important topics. To reiterate, my name is Rebecca Kaplan, and I'm currently a sophomore at the George Washington University, studying international affairs as well as biology. And I'm also a legislative intern at the US Capitol. However, I'd like to preface this by saying that all of the views are my own, and I don't speak on behalf of any of my organizations I'm a part of or that of my work. From here, I'm in this panel. I'll be focusing on female representation in Hungary's government. Hungary is an incredibly important case because the country ranks among the lowest in Europe when it comes to equal representation in government roles. To give some statistics right off the bat, only 7% of ministers and 14% of the Hungarian parliament members are female. This creates a hostile environment, making it difficult to ensure that political decisions are written and implemented through a gender-based lens. A gender equitable agenda cannot be achieved without diverse voices at the policymaking table. The reason for this trend comes from something I'd like to compare to a domino effect. As Hungarian laws push women into their traditional roles in their private lives, they are effectively driven away from full participation in public life. As a result, their perspectives are absent from critical policymaking decisions, leading to a lack of vital protections, including safeguards against psychological and physical violence. Without gender-based policy considerations, safe and fully equitable representation in government is unattainable. However, Hungary didn't always exhibit these anti-woman trends. In fact, it was among the first of the European countries to grant limited women's suffrage back in 1918. Women such as Blanka Teleki and Clara Lovi played significant roles in advancing the feminist agenda, particularly by promoting women's education. These efforts contributed to an average of 25.9% female representation in Hungarian parliament between the years of 1971 and 1985. However, following these years, those numbers dropped dramatically to 9.3%. I use this data to illustrate the recent shift towards extremist parties that systematically bar women from representation in government. Today, women occupy approximately 13% of parliament seats compared to the European Union's average of 33%. While 33% is far from equal representation, it's alarming to see that Hungary falls so significantly below this even inadequate benchmark. To make matters worse, the women who do hold government positions often serve in symbolic or gender-based roles. Take Katalin Novak, for example. She became Hungary's first female head of state in 2022, but before that, she served as the Minister of Family Affairs, a position aligned with promoting traditionalist policies. One of her most notable incentives was the Family Protection Act, which I'll expand on later in this presentation. But for now, know that this act encourages women to adopt traditional domestic roles, reinforcing outdated expectations. And again, that was considered her most notable achievement. We can also examine Viktor Orban's cabinet to further illustrate this point. Orban, Hungary's long-serving prime minister, leads a 14-person cabinet that, until recently, included just one woman, Judith Varga. Varga served as the Minister of Justice until her resignation in 2023. Her departure followed a series of controversies, including her involvement in a scandal concerning a presidential pardon that led to her resignation. Varga also was linked to corruption cases during her tenure. Her resignation left Orban's cabinet without a single member who was female. Orban is widely known for his firm stance on promoting Christianity in Hungary and championing what he calls traditionalist values. Hungary's standing as one of the most extreme countries in Europe in terms of gender inequality in politics, this case must be addressed to ensure that the protection and empowerment of women continues into the future. By acknowledging these realities, we can better advocate for an equitable representation and the inclusion of diverse policymaking voices. Throughout this panel, I'm looking to address the current underrepresentation of women in leadership in Hungary with specific recommendations. My recommendations for Hungary will include ratifying the Istanbul Convention, reversing the ban on discussing gender in schools, and creating gender quotas for members of the government. These steps will all ensure that women become more visible in public life and will aid in resolving the psychological and physical violence that affects women when policy is created without a gender focus in mind. These recommendations must be implemented to help achieve the steps towards women's full participation in government and decision-making spheres without a fear of violence as outlined within the Commission on the Status of Women.
Okay, I'm Paige Garvin. Good afternoon. To reiterate again, I am a second year at the George Washington University studying international affairs with a concentration in conflict resolution and a minor in journalism and mass communications. To begin, I also wanted to thank Dr. Graham for this incredible opportunity. I'm honored to be here today to discuss an issue that affects millions but remains largely invisible, which is technology-facilitated gender-based violence, or TFGBV in Brazil, which I know is a long title, and I have recently learned there are many alternatives. But moving on, we often talk about the power of technology to connect, inform, and empower, and we have heard incredible panels this past week about how technology can be used as a tool to empower and support women. But for far too many women, digital spaces have become arenas of harassment, abuse, and fear. Over 55% of Brazilian women have experienced online violence, whether it's cyberstalking, blackmail, doxing, or hate speech. And the numbers are even worse for marginalized communities such as Black, Indigenous, and LGBTQ+ populations, with 62% of LGBTQ+ individuals report facing TFGBV, yet only 2% of those cases are officially reported. This silence is not accidental, but rather a direct result of the normalization of online abuse and the failure of legal and institutional systems to respond. In Brazil specifically, there have been high-profile cases like journalist Patricia Campos Melo, who was relentlessly harassed, threatened, and defamed simply for doing her job during the 2018 Brazilian election cycle. She received rape threats, blackmail, and false accusations, and despite public outrage, platforms such as Facebook failed to act or remove posts until it was far too late. But this issue is not just about public figures. It affects women in politics, academia, activism, and even everyday social media users who speak out against injustice. Given that technology and social media platforms are relatively new and expansive, there is minimal mention in international agreements other than CEDAW General Recommendation 35. So why is this happening? First, in Brazil, there is a culture of normalization of violence against women. Online violence is often dismissed as not real or as something women should just ignore. And big tech companies making money off of all online engagement, whether good or bad, there is limited prevention. But we know the consequences are very real. Women are silenced, re-traumatized, and even forced to leave their professions or public life altogether. Second, law and policies are not being enforced effectively. The Marco Civil.Internet passed in 2014 was a step in the right direction, establishing digital rights and responsibilities, as well as a basic procedure for responding to violations. But enforcement is weak, reporting mechanisms are broken, and law enforcement lacks the training to handle these cases properly. Many women who report online abuse find that authorities dismiss their cases or fail to take action. And third, the rise of online hate groups is fueling real-world harm. Extremist communities like incel groups have grown unchecked, using platforms to spread misogyny and even encourage violence. A 2022 study found that every 29 minutes, a post promoting rape appears in incel forums. This isn't just an online problem, it's a real and growing security threat. So, to not just point out the negatives, there are a lot of places we can go from here to make digital spaces safer for Brazilian women. The Brazilian government must strengthen enforcement and accountability. And in addition, tech companies have to take responsibility, including stronger content moderation and faster responses to abuse reports. And overall transparency in platform policies is needed. Users deserve to know how their reports are being handled. Also, we must be aware of changing relationships between large tech companies and national governments to ensure that these needs are met. However, as we all know, international cooperation is key. Brazil should look towards frameworks like the Istanbul Convention, which Rebecca mentioned earlier, and the European Union's Digital Services Act for stronger protections. And in all of this, an intersectional approach is critical. We must fund research and support programs for marginalized groups who face the highest rates of online violence. And most importantly, in Brazil, policies must recognize the unique vulnerabilities of Black, Indigenous, and LGBTQ+ women. So thank you so much, and I'm so excited to get started.
Well, thank you all for your lovely introductions. Firstly, I would like to ask, what led to you researching your country?
Just to kind of reiterate what I stated in my introduction, I think stories were a very big driving force for my passion for this particular issue. As I mentioned, I studied forced sterilizations as a phenomenon in other contexts, particularly the Indian one. The context that I'm discussing is Bhid, Maharashtra, where women are undergoing forced hysterectomies, particularly lower caste women who are in agriculture and factory work that are being forced to undergo hysterectomies by business tycoons and village leaders who are perpetuating the system for financial gain. Similar to the Uyghur context, they're coercing these women into hysterectomies to keep them in the workforce without their informed consent, and I believe that this is a particular tactic of the genocide and repression, and it's under-researched. There's so many research gaps in the Bhid context and in the Uyghur context that haven't been updated in years. As I said, there hasn't been an updated report on the Uyghur context in 4 years, and there hasn't been an updated report on Bhid in 6. In the context of current rollbacks on reproductive freedom globally, I think that the question of bodily autonomy retains its saliency throughout the world, and this research gap really amplifies the need for reinforcement on this issue across contexts, and I believe I couldn't have adequately pondered it without analyzing this case of the Uyghur genocide. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, and I can add on to that. So I'm a first generation Salvadorian American, and I chose to focus on El Salvador really because of my deep personal connection to the country and its people. Throughout my life, I've had the privilege to visit El Salvador regularly, and my experiences there have been both very enlightening as well as heartbreaking. I've been able to firsthand see the resilience of Salvadorian people, but I've also felt the pain of loss. 2 members of my family have actually fallen victim to gang violence, and this is just a tragedy that really underscores the very real and personal impact for the country's ongoing struggles with crime and security. And so, given this background, I do understand the appeal of President Bukele's tough stance on gangs. But as someone that is deeply invested in the well-being of all Salvadorians, I cannot ignore the concerning side effects of the policies that are in place and their specific impact on women. Because we're seeing, like I've said, an erosion of civil liberties and an increase in human rights violations. And what is particularly alarming is how these issues are being overshadowed by the positive narrative that is surrounding Bukele's crime reduction efforts. And so by focusing on El Salvador, I aim to raise awareness on the ongoing struggles of Salvadorian women. And I want to use my unique position as someone with ties to both El Salvador and the United States to amplify the voices that are often going unheard. And so in essence, it's a way to honor my roots and to contribute to a just and equitable future for a country that has given me so much of my own identity.
I appreciate your thoughtful response, Valentina. And I was wondering if you had any difficulties when you were conducting your research.
Thanks, Seamus. Yes, I did. I will say that in terms of difficulties in finding governmental documents, that wasn't as hard for me. El Salvador is actually quite on top of submitting their national action plans and their CEDAW reports. And I also didn't find any trouble in finding shadow reports that were also submitted to the United Nations. Just recently, there was one submitted a few months ago that was really helpful in helping center around my research and what I'm coming here today to speak about. But the trouble that I did find was mainly on quantitative data that is actually showing the prevalence of these issues, and recent quantitative data at that. So the data on gender-based violence specifically, though it might already be inaccurate because of the failure to report due to fear of retaliation, this data has not been updated. The most recent data that I found was from about 5 years ago, where the World Bank stated that El Salvador has the highest rate of intentional female homicides globally at 13.8 per 100,000. And this lack of data is particularly alarming for many reasons, but what makes it most alarming for me is considering that many Salvadorian women that I've had the privilege to speak with saw an increase of femicide and gender-based violence, especially during and right after the COVID-19 pandemic. So not having more recent numbers on this makes one only assume that they're much worse, especially hearing from what the women themselves are actually saying. There's also a lack of available numbers in how much funding is actually going for women's rights initiatives. I'm not seeing any numbers that are going to civil society organizations and women's rights organizations. And it even was a difficulty in finding how much the government is actually providing for their own government-initiated women's rights organizations. For example, the government has created something known as the Salvadorian Institute for Advancement of Women, known as the ISD-EMU. And this is typically an initiative that they like to quote a lot from when they're reporting to CEDAW and for their national action plans, but not having that adequate data and to see how much money is actually being given to go through these resources. Again, it's just really alarming. And I know, Paige, we also were talking about kind of similar issues. So I don't know if you wanted to add on a little bit about the troubles that you were having in the case of Brazil.
Yeah, definitely. I also had similar issues like Valentina mentioned. One of the main challenges I came across in researching TFGBV is the lack of long-term data and studies, since TFGBV is a more recent phenomenon, as is the technical revolution and rise of social media platforms. Research is still catching up, and official statistics often fail to classify online harassment, doxing, or cyberstalking as serious offenses. This makes it incredibly difficult to measure the full scope of this problem. And additionally, while some policies like Brazil's marcocivil.internet, like I mentioned earlier, exist, enforcement is weak and we don't have long-term data on their effectiveness. So many global frameworks mention online violence, but lack concrete mechanisms to address it. For example, CEDAW Gen Recommendation 35 was revolutionary in addressing TFGBV as a rising issue, but offered a first step, not necessarily a detailed execution plan or international standards. And without strong data, it is hard to really determine which responses truly work, as well as the long-term effects on TFGBV survivors. So in my research, I found that moving forward, we need better research collectively, intersectional data collection, and collaboration between governments, grassroots organizations, and tech companies to truly build effective, long-lasting solutions.
Thank you. Was there anything about your findings that was surprising to you?
Yeah, I'd be happy to start on this one. Well, mine's a bit ironic, especially considering we've already mentioned we're all students here, specifically in that our research is stemming from a gender-based class. There's actually a ban on the teaching of gender in schools in Hungary. And it's so incredibly upsetting to think that a girl in Hungary cannot have that same opportunity. It's vital to teach about gender in schools because gender education is essential to developing a person's understanding of how gender shapes identity, especially for that intersectionality lens of it. For example, there's intersectionality between gender and marginalized groups such as LGBTQ and disabled women, and how being female can create complications in these fields and spaces. It's important for pupils to understand how, one, gender may block you from certain opportunities, two, the pay and resource gaps that exist within our society, and three, how we can best combat all of these. Teaching gender ensures that future policymakers are aware of how traditional gender dynamics can negatively affect a woman's well-being and constrain her in her work opportunities. Without this knowledge, political leaders are underprepared to address many forms of discrimination that affect women in diverse identities. Education is also a tool of empowerment. I mean, growing up, my own parents would always tell me that someone can never take away the knowledge I've already acquired. But if we don't open up those opportunities to the next generation, we are actively taking away and limiting their prospects. We're not giving them that same advantage that they deserve. Education is empowerment for women to be more politically active and to take on leadership roles with confidence. And Hungary banning gender sends the message that being a female is a topic of taboo. If the word gender is omitted from the classroom, it'll be lost in the political discussions, thus silencing the most pressing concerns of women. Hungary must take action to reverse this ban and reintroduce gender into the classroom.
I completely agree. And Paige, I was just wondering if you could talk about the theme that I had noticed in all of the memos, which there's this distinct fear of retaliation that's resulted in many cases of violence against women and girls going completely unreported. And I was just wondering, how can this be combated, particularly when those in power are the perpetrators of this violence?
Yeah, so I want to particularly focus on the part of your question about underreporting, if someone wants to follow up later on the second part. But underreporting of TFGBV in Brazil is a major issue, largely driven by fear of retaliation, societal stigma, and lack of institutional support. Many women, especially those from marginalized communities, choose not to report, quite frankly, because they have little trust in law enforcement, worry about being blamed, or in fear of escalating threats from their attackers. A major factor is the normalization of online violence. Women are often told to just ignore it or that it's not real violence or harassment. And this exact dismissive attitude silences victims and discourages them from seeking justice. Additionally, as I highlighted earlier, many women who do end up reporting TFGBV find that their cases are dismissed or not taken seriously due to the lack of proper training and standardized responses from law enforcement officials. So, to answer the question of how do we combat this is difficult because it is largely based in societal and cultural attitudes. But some possible solutions that I have found include strengthening law enforcement training and response through training to recognize and handle these cases seriously, as well as clear legal penalties for perpetrators and stronger protection mechanisms for victims. Private tech companies can improve anonymous reporting options that include fast-tracked legal support for women who report TFGBV, and finally, changing online narratives through campaigns, shifting the narrative that TFGBV is just online drama to it being a serious crime. Ultimately, combating underreporting requires cultural, legal, and institutional changes. Women must feel safe and supported when coming forward, and perpetrators must face real consequences.
Yeah, I definitely can also speak on this particular topic. I mean, underreporting of psychological and physical violence is a huge issue within Hungary right now, and measures must be taken in order to prevent, report, and counteract all forms of violence against women in government, as it can deeply impact their ability to go into the sector. I mean, being in public life is intimidating within itself, to say the least. It requires courage to be able to hear consistent criticism that is bound to occur for every politician, no matter their political stances. They're putting their opinions out into the public and placing themselves open to scrutiny. But sometimes this gets past the point of criticism and turns into violence and harassment, which is where it becomes a true issue. There are programs and laws in various countries that have helped to combat these forms of violence. I mean, for example, I know Paige also mentioned this before, but the Istanbul Convention has been essential in promoting equality for women subject to violence, including those in the political sphere. To date, 39 countries have ratified this convention and 7 have not in the European Council, with ratified members being required to implement the criteria. Although the convention does not explicitly mention politically motivated gender-based violence against women, it broadly addresses the violence against women in all sectors of life, which can encompass the political context. For example, Article 4 discusses the right for women to live free of violence in the public sphere with an emphasis on gender equity in public life. Article 34 also discusses stalking, a psychological violence, and defines it as a violence against women. This is important for women politics because there was a survey that sampled 54 members of parliament across the globe, where it was found that women were at a significantly higher risk for harassment than their male counterparts. Despite these protections that the Istanbul Convention outlines, Hungary remains one of those 7 countries that refuses to ratify the document because they continue to cite it as, quote, an attempt to push gender politics. They're refusing to ratify the Istanbul Convention against domestic violence. This isn't the first time Hungary has taken a backlash to feminist policy, though. In one instance, Bernadette Bakos, a deputy from Hungary's Green Party, introduced a bill to eliminate taxes on period products. She was then met with unwelcome comments such as, and I quote, "We should also fund men's diapers for their wet dreams." If you just step into her shoes for a second, could you imagine fighting for this important and serious legislation and being mocked so inappropriately for it? It undermines her work as a politician, someone who is looking to create laws to aid women. It shows exactly why documents such as the Istanbul Convention must be ratified. The Hungarian government refusing to ratify this document is a refusal to acknowledge the psychological and physical violence that women, especially in leadership positions, face. Right now, the situation is like a chicken and the egg example of not enough women are in politics to push for ratification, but the protections needed for more women to enter politics in the political workforce are contained within the convention. There have been positive effects in the countries that have adopted the convention, such as Italy, where they quickly saw policies that more harshly fought against crimes related to sexual harassment. The Hungarian government ratifying this document would demonstrate a commitment to addressing violence against women in government, and the lack of such creates a hostile environment for women in Europe, showing them that protecting them against violence is not at the top of the policy agenda, and that hostile actors can unjustly block this crucial document.
Thank you. And I was wondering, were there any cases in which there were similarities between the US and your country of interest?
I mean, in my case in particular, I don't think there are a lot of similarities, but there are definitely a lot of connections, specifically because the United States has been so vocal in opposition to what's going on in Xinjiang. But I would think that in conjunction with that, the lack of data on this topic, especially on the US front, has been especially surprising because it's been one of the more vocal nations, as I've said. The most recent full-scale report on China's human rights abuses was done by the Department of State in their series of 2023 country reports published in 2024. However, in this report, there was a significant lack of data and literature regarding forced sterilizations. As I noted, the phrase forced sterilization was used just 3 times in the entire report, as opposed to the word labor, which was used around 20 times. And I think that this lack of mention is particularly interesting because of this recent condemnation, like the Thai sanctions and the corporate disengagement, as aforementioned. So while there aren't a lot of similarities, there's definitely a lot of connections and a lot of gaps that I was able to find in United States response to what's going on in Xinjiang.
Yeah, I can also add on this. So, one of the most surprising things that I found when I was conducting my research was the striking parallels between Bukele's administration in El Salvador and the Trump administration in the US. And it's not just about the tough on crime rhetoric that we're seeing happening in both areas, but both leaders really seem to tap into this anti-globalism discourse, expressing skepticism towards international institutions and agreements. And they both also are exhibiting what I see as a deep hostility towards critical civil society organizations as well as free press. For example, when conducting my research with the Bukele administration, his administration, much like Trump's, seems to really carefully select which news outlets he's engaging with, and his administration is attempting to control the narrative and limiting the access to critical voices. The accusations against El Faro, for example, which forced them into journalistic exile, to me echo the way that Trump is targeting news organizations like the Associated Press for coverage that he didn't like, and even threatening to pull funding. And so seeing this parallel, it's fascinating, but also really concerning. in handling the opposition, because for me, it suggests a broader trend of populist authoritarian leaders using similar tactics to consolidate power and silence dissent, regardless of what their specific political ideologies are. And so to me, it really makes you think about the global rise of this type of leadership and the impact that it's having on democracy and human rights, but specifically women's rights.
Thank you. In what ways are these new so-called protective measures and legislation being used as covert methods of control and a way of repressing female bodily autonomy?
Absolutely. I'm happy to get started on this one. I mean, hearing this question, I immediately think of Hungary's Family Protection Action Plan. Essentially, this is a plan from 2019 that promotes a very traditionalist agenda and encourages women to have children with monetary incentives. Policies in this plan include mortgage relief, but only if the female of the family has 2 or more children. It also outlines exempting personal income tax for mothers who are either under the age of 30 years old, those with 4 children, and women who give birth or adopt within 2 years after university. And just for perspective, that means if I were a woman in Hungary right now, I'd have to give birth within the next 4 years to meet eligibility under that requirement. If you look across all of these, it's incentivizing women to give birth and act as caregivers. If you think about it, a woman is looking to get her career started within those first 2 years after university and in her young life, prior to 30 years old. We're here stressing about jobs and internships. Now imagining adding the criteria of pregnancy to that list to our that our male colleagues wouldn't have to worry about, that is incredibly stressful and difficult for a woman to take on. Due to the stereotypes that we're still working to overturn, many jobs will also look negatively upon hiring a pregnant woman. And then childcare is not always an option for the working woman either, making these criteria very difficult to actually obtain. And adding this all up, again, it's really difficult for the working woman specifically to get these income tax benefits when they're only eligible at such a young age. Of course, fertility only for a woman will be, right through, early 20s or 20s into 30s. And again, only having these incentives while they're trying to start off their career is going to be absolutely detrimental. In addition, a woman could also decide for personal or medical reasons that she'd not like to have more than one child or not have children at all, which is perfectly okay. However, this decision bars her from important benefits just because she wants to focus on herself rather than to take up a traditional role, especially, again, so early on in her life. It's enforcing the idea that women should be the caregiver in private life, but this is an inherently discriminatory practice. It's leaving men in the public sphere as the sole decision makers, since their wives are back at home with the children to get these benefits, thus once again leaving women out of leadership roles and out of discussion. It brings us back to the position where new items in political agendas do not reflect the needs of women. The Family Protection Action Plan does lay out childcare options and loans, but they're all conditional on a woman taking up traditionalist positions in the private life, which will lead to decreased representation and voice in the public sphere. It's a discriminatory practice which leads to unequal division of labor and unfair power relations between the man and the woman. Oh, and to not forget as well, Hungary bars single women from adopting children, meaning infertile and unmarried women are completely ineligible for these benefits. The underlying hope of this plan is clear: to set up a woman to be in the home caring for children rather than amplifying their voices and careers, which is so desperately needed.
To kind of follow up on Rebecca's answer, in the Chinese, particularly Uyghur case, these measures are usually anti-traditionalist, but are framed as avenues of reproductive justice rather than coercive practices. Particularly in the case of IUD insertion, these procedures can be disguised as routine reproductive care. And these methods subvert traditionalist ideas for the most part. And the idea that reproductive care could be weaponized has been in the playbook for centuries. Although these methods go against the traditionalist framework, they still restrict a woman's autonomy by barring them from gaining informed consent in the absence of coercion. This type of absence of informed consent with the additional added impetus of coercion is seen in the bead context as well. The lack of informed consent with coercion is how these measures are used to repress autonomy in both the Uyghur case and the bead case, which I think, although goes against the traditionalist framework, is still used as a protective measure, as a quote unquote protective measure to suppress women.
Thank you. Just in general, how have regional customs and traditions played a role in facilitating this gender-based violence in your study?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to take this one. Well, some of you may know that same-sex marriage is illegal within Hungary, and their fundamental law from 2011 reinforces this. The fundamental law links parental roles to their traditional binary genders and enforces a rigid system where people may feel afraid to present themselves as who they are. It also defines marriage between a man and a woman, and furthermore states that a mother should be a woman and a father should be a man, eliminating any gender non-binary citizens as well. Non-binary citizens are not recognized because the policy defines gender as someone's sex assigned at birth. Transgender individuals are erased from the public and private sector and are marginalized. And this policy limits those individuals from the government resources that they need to protect themselves and their families, creating a form of social alienation vulnerability. It's yet another example of Hungary taking out marginalized genders from their vocabulary, which prevents those people from entering into spaces which they can create change and where urgent action is much required and necessary.
I can also add on to this question because I've already spoken about it briefly about machismo culture. And for those who may not know, machismo refers to a strong or exaggerated sense of manliness or masculinity, and it's often associated with characteristics like dominance, aggression, and rejection of vulnerability. And this culture remains the strongest and most prevalent in Latin American countries, where it has been part of the culture for many generations. And it can even be traced back to the time of Spanish conquest, with various cultural norms and myths portraying men as needing to assert their power and dominance over others to, in a sense, prove their masculinity or prove their worth. This is just as much a systemic issue as it is a personal one. Machismo probably does get perpetuated. It does get perpetuated through the government, but it also begins at the home, where sons are being taught to be strong and their daughters are being taught to be docile and domestic. And this is where we get that creation of the dynamic where male authority is normalized and female autonomy is suppressed. And the imbalance of power establishes a foundation upon what we're seeing today, the legacy of machismo, which control, manipulation, and ultimately violence against women can flourish. Men are socialized to believe that their dominance is in their natural right, and women are taught to accept a subordination. And like I said, this is creating the breeding ground for abuse, where acts of violence are often excused, minimized, or even justified as a man asserting his rightful place. And so I know there was a question that is asking for concrete examples in terms of tackling this issue. And I think it goes back to what I was saying before. We need to be empowering women economically through the multi-support donor program that I had said in the beginning, and as well as strengthening women's rights organizations like Ormusa, Kamkavis Trends that want to work to examine and challenge the power structures that perpetuate inequality. Increasing the funding for women's rights organizations. Many of these women's rights organizations are already doing such incredible work to actually tackling the question of machismo culture. For example, Colectiva Feminista is one organization in El Salvador that's really big on their social media platform, and they are hosting many events on masculinity and machismo culture to discuss exactly how it's perpetuating violence against women. So amplifying these organizations that are already doing so much work, as well as giving financial help, would just really help furthering the removal, hopeful, of the machismo culture in El Salvador.
Yeah, and similarly, I would also like to add on to this, as I hope it helps answer the question in the chat about norms. Regional customs and deeply ingrained societal norms in Brazil have played a significant role in facilitating and normalizing technology-facilitated gender-based violence. While technology is the tool that enables the violence, historical gender norms, racial discrimination, and cultural hypersexualization have created an environment where such violence is both tolerated and underreported, as I've mentioned. Brazilian society has long been influenced by the hypersexualization of women, a legacy reinforced by media and entertainment. And this has contributed to the perception that women's online presence is inherently provocative or inviting harassment. Women who experience TFGBV, such as having their private images leaked, receiving misogynistic threats, or being doxxed, are often blamed for their own victimization rather than being seen as individuals deserving of protection. As mentioned previously, this discourages victims from reporting their experiences as they fear judgment rather than justice. And additionally, as Valentina explained, in El Salvador, Brazilian society also is heavily influenced by machismo culture, a traditional set of gender norms that reinforce male dominance. In online spaces, these attitudes manifest in the way women are treated, particularly those who challenge traditional gender norms, such as female journalists, politicians, activists, and LGBTQ plus individuals. Women in these fields are disproportionately targeted by online hate campaigns, including rape threats, physical violence, often with little intervention from authorities or platform moderators. And the impact of TFGBV is exacerbated by historical racial and class-based discrimination, particularly against Black and Indigenous women. Similarly, LGBTQ plus individuals face high rates of homophobic and transphobic TFGBV, yet Brazil's culture and political landscape have often failed to provide adequate protections. Regional customs and traditions have not only contributed to the prevalence of TFGBV, but also have made it harder to combat. And the normalization of sexism, weak legal enforcement, and political oppression to gender equality have all created an ecosystem where online violence is widespread yet rarely punished. But this isn't specific to Brazil. These issues and ideas of cultural sexism, racism, and homophobia manifest themselves in algorithms as well for these platforms, making it incredibly difficult to escape. And only by challenging these deeply ingrained norms can Brazil move towards a digital space that is truly safe and inclusive for women.
Thank you. And then our final question will be, what is the intersection of cultural relativism and feminist action, and how does this affect the ways in which non-governmental organizations or NGOs and women's rights groups provide aid?
I'll take a stab at this question. I think that cultural relativism should be an inherent consideration of feminist action, even though they're often seen in dichotomy. I think that when we're creating a movement with the mark of being intersectional across gender identity, race, and sexual orientation and more, we must also take into account other forms of diversity that can impact how someone walks through life. Particularly geographic diversity can inform norms as well, which can inform our buy-in and can also tweak work done to better suit the cultural temperament of a region. I think there are also a lot of similarities between cultural relativism as a movement and feminism. I recently read a study by Ava Brems where she delineates that although they're seen as diametrically opposed when discussing a human rights framework, both of them have a lot of similarities in the qualms that they have with the traditional liberal concept of human rights. They believe that the traditional liberal concept of human rights is either too Western or too exclusive, and they both want to broaden the scope of inclusion just through different lenses to emphasize the specifics. Brems posits that cultural relativists can shift culture to be not as monolithic and more adaptable, which is a point that I personally agree with. I don't think that anybody is in a position to determine the essence of a culture, and norms can shift all the time, particularly in a globalized world that we live in. And I think that both movements have the impetus for bringing it back to the individual and codifying and defining rights more thoroughly. And I think that that's where my qualm with aid providing organizations currently resides. I think that across sector and context, aid providing organizations tend to fit into the one size fits all category, applying the same solutions from one nation state to another, which really limits the effectiveness of measures taken because it rarely accounts for the voices of local women or individuals who would partake in these very initiatives. I believe that, to Brems's point, it's essential that we bring our movements back to a discrete individual rather than an abstract, creating a more intersectional and inclusive basis for feminism. We must start making spaces for different norms that aren't always perfectly compatible, but can be understood.
Yeah, I would also like to answer this question. It's a difficult one, but I think it's important. While global conversations about gender-based violence and digital safety are essential, it is equally important to recognize that Western feminism and traditional Western notions of freedom are not the only solutions to addressing TFGBV in general. Many mainstream feminist approaches, often shaped by white, upper class, and Western perspectives, fail to fully capture the lived realities of marginalized women in Brazil, particularly Black, Indigenous, LGBTQ, and working class women. Western feminist narratives tend to emphasize individual autonomy, free speech, and digital empowerment, often assuming that solutions like more online participation or self-defense strategies and digital literacy programs are sufficient to combat these issues. However, in Brazil, where many women face intersecting struggles of race, class, and structural inequality, these approaches often fall short. Some challenges include inequality in access to digital spaces, focus of legal reforms that overlook cultural and social change, and that legal and police systems are not designed to protect women in all places. Rather than imposing what would be a top-down feminist style framework, solutions must come from Brazilian women themselves, like Preeti mentioned, particularly those from historically marginalized communities. And local feminist movements, activists, and community leaders have been leading the fight against TFGBV in ways that are culturally relevant and community driven. Some key aspects of local solutions that I've found in my research include Afro-Brazilian and Indigenous feminist activism. Black and Indigenous women's organizations emphasize collective safety, community accountability, and reclaiming digital spaces rather than relying solely on legal systems that have historically excluded them. And community-based reporting and restorative justice approaches. Instead of relying on state intervention, some groups focus on peer support networks and alternative forms of justice that prioritize the safety and well-being of survivors. And intersectional digital education programs are also something that I found. And for these solutions to be effective, they must be shaped by the voices of those who are most affected. This means recognizing that not all women experience TFGBV the same way, and policies must be tailored to reflect Brazil's racial, class, and geographic diversity. So challenging Eurocentric and North American tech policies that fail to account for Brazil's political, social, and historical context. So this is necessary in supporting grassroots organizations and local digital feminists who are already doing the work on the ground rather than relying solely on international NGOs or corporate-driven solutions. And these are all essential in providing an adequate intersectional solution that includes all women.
Well, thank you all for your participation and your incredibly detailed answers. I appreciate your dedication, and if any attendees would like to see the actual policy briefs that they worked extremely hard on and spent a lot of time on, please visit our website. They're all going to be available at geia.elliott.gwu.edu. And for more information about GEIA in general, you can follow us on social media. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. And also, if after the meeting you have follow-up questions, feel free to send us an email at geia@gwu.edu. Thank you again, and I'll now open the floor for questions. And it seems as if we have, let's see. We have a question about if the Gender Equality Initiative in International Affairs, Elliott, is under attack or being threatened with the withholding of funds from our current administration. So I think that's best to be handed off to Professor Graham.
Thank you, Seamus, and thank you, Joanne, for that very important and relevant and timely question. So first up, just to say, we're not under attack as of yet, but it is something that I am watching very, very closely and discussing with the leadership team at the Elliott School, really monitoring what is happening in terms of state universities and how that might affect private universities like George Washington. So it is worrying. It is creating a lot of fear. There are question marks about the ongoing teaching of gender in any course, obviously, at universities in the US. Just to say that we have been told by our general counsel that we are not breaking the law. I think we all know that, but that we can continue with our program, that we can continue with our DEI program. I'm also the co-chair of our Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Council at the Elliott School. And this work is hugely important to me personally, as well as professionally, and to all my students and my colleagues. It has meant that we have focused on underrepresented populations of students and faculty and staff to ensure that they are included in the Elliott School, that we have taken a close look at our curricula to make sure that all those populations are included in our curriculum and our courses, that we have readings and peer-reviewed journal articles from populations from the Global South or majority countries, that we are ensuring that we're bringing in the voices of Indigenous women and men and LGBTQ plus populations. So there has been a huge amount of work done to ensure that our programs are truly diverse and equitable. And we know that if we do not include the voices of all people, these so-called minority groups are actually the majority of people on this planet. And if we don't bring in these voices, obviously that exclusion is going to harm not only their security, but everyone's security. And it's key not just for foreign policy, but also domestic policy, that our students have a deep understanding of these issues and that they can be leaders on these issues in the US and in the work that they want to do overseas. So just to say that it is a concern. I'm glad you asked the question, and we are watching it closely. We, as of yet, have not changed our policy or our program. If that does happen in the future, I will obviously be alerting people. I suppose one of the other things to say is we're in this really difficult situation as well, because we don't want to preemptively self-censor. We need to stand up to regimes or governments that try to silence us. And at the same time, I need to protect my program and my students. And I need to make sure that they have access to a top-notch education that is genuinely inclusive. So that's really what I'm dealing with at the moment, is how do we balance these two concerns? My priority is with my program surviving and my students getting a first-class education. If I need to change the name of my program for that to continue, then that is what I might have to do. Beyond that, I don't know at this point. So I'm really hoping I don't have to make these changes, but it's a really growing concern. And latest reports are that state universities are already changing their curricula, taking out the words women, taking out the words gender, even though men and sex can remain. So we can see the discriminatory gender norms that are being reinforced into our institutions and our systems by this action. So the executive order on gender ideology, it's a classic in terms of what this panel is about. The executive order that says defending women from gender ideology doesn't defend women. It's actually harmful for women. It delinks gender discrimination from patriarchal norms and values. And so, so we're watching all of this closely. We are deeply concerned, and we will obviously take any guidance from our general counsel and the leadership of George Washington University. So thank you for asking that question.
Thank you, Dr. Graham. And I'm currently in her Women in Global Politics class, and every week there's new updates that are just more and more saddening. Right before break, as you're talking about potentially having to take out the word gender from the program, just it's just really surprising, and at least for me, very saddening because I've a little biased, but I've really enjoyed the class, the WGSS program in general at GW has been incredible, and it it's troubling. So it seems as if we have a question that's asking, each of your work has addressed particular country contexts, but many of these challenges have transnational elements. For example, online violence can be perpetrated by those both within and outside a particular country. What kinds of transnational solutions and engagement might be possible or needed to ensure that actors in one country cannot perpetrate these kinds of violence towards women in another?
Thank you, Seamus, for the question. I think that the transnational question is really important. I know Paige really emphasized the need for global cooperation, and I think that's been a salient theme across our presentations, the need for international actors cross-sectorally to coalesce under shared principles and shared norms. But I think particularly international organizations, supranational organizations like the United Nations, particularly UNESCO, have a really special vantage point as a normative body to set global norms that member states claim to forward by virtue of membership. So I'd really say that strengthening that normative framework and really formulating the UN's raison d'etre, or the reason for being of the UN, in the next few years will be really important in combating transnational violence, because if the point of condemnation is really firm, if our global norms are really firm, we're able to coalesce and sort of counteract a less powerful actor in a global context. I'd say when we all coalesce together, we're more powerful than one nation state. So I think that I would propose that as my answer.
Yeah, and to also answer this question, I think TFGBV specifically is a interesting case because technology, as we know, is not limited by borders. So international cooperation is incredibly necessary to hold perpetrators accountable and protect victims across countries. I mentioned earlier that, and like Preeti just mentioned, stronger international legal frameworks are necessary. And it's interesting now that we see this shift towards promoting legal frameworks. We just need to expand upon them and kind of take influence from other current agreements like the Budapest Convention on cybercrime to include specific provisions on TFGBV and establishing agreements for severe cases of online harassment, cyberstalking, and image-based abuse. I think that specifically with TFGBV, the best international cooperation should come from holding tech companies accountable, because that is truly what is crossing transnationally. So enforcing a universal content moderation standard and requiring platforms to respond quickly to cross-border harassment cases, and possibly even imposing financial penalties that fail to on platforms that fail to remove harmful content targeting individuals. And like I mentioned earlier, it's important to monitor the relationships between these big tech companies and governments. Currently, I would say that this shift between tech companies in the United States, as well as the current administration, is a little worrying in making sure that these needs are met. But overall, victim protection and support networks are what should be at the forefront, and establishing international digital safety hotlines and a standard is the most important.
Yeah. And also to add on and introduce Hungary as well in this context, I mean, we can't forget about these documents that so desperately need to be ratified as soon as possible. I mean, for example, the Istanbul Convention, which I feel like I've spoken so much about in this webinar. However, when I went to go research it, there were some web pages, documents, etc., that hadn't been updated since 2020, 2023. And I was trying to, look for information of specifically 2025. What's the most up-to-date movement in this particular document? And there was just nothing. it shows that the international community could sometimes forget about these important documents in the midst of everything that's going on, but that just cannot happen. We cannot let that slide. In addition, there also just needs to be increased, global norms to really push through these advancements. I mean, for example, I know some countries, I believe France has recently taken up quotas in the government in order to increase participation of women. And yeah, we need to expand those particular incentives throughout countries. And even though Hungary may not be taking that initiative right now, if the global norm collectively changes to implement these, if we see trends to start with gender quotas in governments, then we can increase that 33% average over time. It's not going to take just one person. It's going to take that international cooperation in order to really speed up that process. And remember that this is an issue that's actively harming women throughout the world. And if one country is not going to take the stance, we got to encourage them to through our own means and however we can possible.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. And thank you all once again for taking the time out of your day to come watch this webinar with us. Just wanted to once again leave a minute or so for any other questions. But I would like to pass it off to Professor Graham.
Thank you, Seamus. I just want to say thank you all for joining us here today. Thank you to each of our panelists and Seamus, of course. We have put in the chat box the link to our website and also our email if you want to follow up with us. And also if you want to read the policy briefs that each of our students has written and will shortly be published online. So thank you again to everybody and see you next time. Okay, bye for now.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining.